Injury management is key to everything that we do. We try and prevent injury where we can, and we try and optimise performance after that. The big challenge with cycling is the gross repetition. So roughly 5,500 pedal strokes per hour, multiplied by how many hours that people are riding per week. It's an enormous amount of repetition, and as much as we're covering a lot of distance, it is a very, very static posture. The body is not built for it to be a static structure, it's built to have variation of movement, and that's one of the big issues associated with cycling, is that it doesn't create any of that variation in movement. As a result, you need to be doing things off the bike to minimise the trauma and damage that's being created by working so repetitively on the bike. So there you go. And ultimately performance improvement too. Nothing makes you go slower or faster than being injured or uncomfortable, and both of those things can be managed through self-treatment. So when we talk about self-treatment, what are we speaking about? The classic one is stretching, which I'm sure you're all aware of, and which Sheila will go into in more depth in a moment. So it's really simple. There's various types of it. There's lots of different techniques. There's lots of different types of stretches. But Sheila will go through the most common presentations of injuries and postural imbalances that we see. And again, cycling, its big issue is that it tends to reinforce our already poor daily postures and behaviours. Most of us spend a lot of time sitting at computers doing this, spending a lot of time in cars, or spending a lot of time seated. That really craned forward head posture can create lots and lots of damage, and cycling reinforces that. Self-massage, so as simple as kind of poking and prodding and giving things a bit of a rub, but also using these forms of torture device, so the foam rollers and the spiky balls, which I'll be speaking about. And then ultimately strengthening as well. So strengthening not in the classic sense that people talk about going and doing, really strong lifting and all of those sorts of things, which certainly you can do and probably should do if you're an exclusive cyclist. One of the big issues associated with cycling is actually loss of bone density. So if people aren't doing significant amounts of load-bearing exercises outside of their bike riding, they're very prone to having lower bone density later in life, particularly female cyclists. All right. And with any of these things, and with cycling itself, but also with a lot of these techniques that we're talking about in terms of stretching and strengthening, form is everything. Technique is king. If you are not doing it properly, stop. So it's a really good way of reinforcing bad behaviours if you continue to do exercises highly fatigued, or if your form drops away. We don't really care about load. We don't really care about how heavy these lifts are or how difficult they are. What we care about is the fact that you are doing them properly. So the reason we care so much about form is that the body has certain ways of moving and certain motor recruitment patterns, we call it. So we want certain types of muscles to fire before others. And if you reinforce bad behaviours, you're highly likely to create these habits and patterns of movement that are going to create injury in the long run. Righto, in terms of dosage, so how often should you be self-treating? Basically, none of us ride a bike to stretch, and none of us ride a bike to get on a foam roller or to get on a spiky ball. The trouble is we have to. As I said, the sheer repetition means that we must be doing this kind of thing. Or as Lisa said, if you don't do it, we'll see you sooner rather than later in at Osteohealth or seeing another allied health professional. So the fact that we don't do these self-maintenance strategies means that you're most likely to get injured. And again, because it's not a particularly traumatic activity, all of these things creep up on you. They're quite insidious. They can often manifest themselves over weeks, months or years, where if you go out and tear a hamstring through sprinting, you'll know about it immediately. With a lot of the overuse type injuries that we sustain on bikes, you won't, in the postural imbalances, they won't really kind of catch up with you until it can be years down the track. Always seek professional help if you're injured. The examples and so on we're giving this evening are not an exhaustive list. There are endless options, and each person kind of needs slight variations on all of these things based on their history of injury, the way they sit on the bike, what they're trying to achieve with their cycling, all of those sorts of things. And this is a bit of the Tom Barry rule of self-management. At least 10% of your time, so if you're training, at least 10% of the time that you spend training for the entire week should be spent self-management. So if you ride your bike for 10 hours a week, at least an hour of it should be spent stretching, poking and prodding, strengthening, stabilising. Hands up, who does that? That's very good. You all get a golden star. And
helps when you don't ride 2 hours a week too.
yeah.
A whole lot easier.
And I'm a bit hypocritical because I've only started doing this as I've gotten a bit older, but Lisa's been doing it for years, so it certainly makes a big difference. And like anything, good, consistent behaviour over time creates really good outcomes. And it doesn't need to be a lot. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is foam rolling. So has everyone been exposed to foam rollers? Righto, the key with foam rolling, so in terms of, oh there you go, there's our special offer for tonight. So 20% off foam rollers and spiky balls. We don't actually have that many here. They're normally, I can't remember what they are, add 20% on that, so 40 and 20. And if you get both, they're $50, so there you go.
If we just take 2 seconds, then we'll shuffle forward 1 row.
Okay.
We can fit everyone in.
Righto, so the aim of foam rolling is basically you want to improve your range of movement. So there's a couple of aspects to ranges of movement. We look for the range, so how far can you move a certain body part? And the classic issue we see with cyclists typically is hip flexibility. So people get very tight through their hips because of the shortening of the hip flexor and also the shortening and tightening of the glutes. So we want to improve how far you can move that. We also want to improve the quality of movement. There's a thing called reciprocal inhibition, but basically opposing muscle groups will tighten and shorten and be dysfunctional if the other muscle group is really tight. So the classic tension we find with the hips are hip flexor tightness on the bike because it's constantly shortened. The opposing muscle group to the hip flexors are the glutes, which are hip extensors. So if these aren't working properly, these won't be working properly either. The glutes are the power pack of cycling. So the pedal stroke is mostly about gluteal activation. So when you're pedaling, and there's a diagram coming up later in the presentation, but when you're pedaling, at the top of your pedal stroke, there's a little bit of quadricep to try and get the knee over the top from 12 to 1-ish. And then it's hip extension, which is all glute. And then there's quad, the next bit, tiny bit of hamstring and calf at the bottom, and then you repeat the action. So glutes are really, really important. There's another key concept as well called sequential force summation, but basically it means that movement starts centrally and it accelerates peripherally. So if you think about cracking a whip, it starts with a very small movement centrally, and by the time you get to the whip crack at the end, you're breaking the speed of sound. It's the same with pedaling. You start with a very small stabilisation movement through your pelvis, and then you start with the knee extension and then quad, and it accelerates throughout the length of the pedal stroke, gaining more power. It's really important to have good functional glutes. And the issue with cycling is the repetition associated with it causes these muscles to get trigger points in them, and it also gets them to become myofascially tight, which we'll talk about in a moment. So range of movement is really important because if you can't flex your hip enough, your pelvis will tuck under. It'll put a lot of pressure through your lower back. It'll cause you to hunch and reach on the bike. It'll change the way you relate to the saddle. It'll alter your frontal profile to the wind, and you'll definitely get dropped like I did this morning. Thank you, Tom Nixon. We also want to improve the quality of movement. So if you've got really tight glutes again, and you externally rotate at the top of the pedal stroke, and you've seen lots of people who pedal with a bit of a V, so they come out at the top of the pedal stroke, they have to fire really hard through the opposing muscles to try and straighten that knee up and to try and track clean. So over time it becomes quite fatiguing. You've effectively got muscle groups working against each other. This is clearly not a good outcome for the efficiencies associated with cycling. Reducing the trauma associated with overuse. So again, the cause of a lot of tendinopathies long term is muscular tightness and lack of control. And so with cycling in particular, again, you get those trigger points activated. You also get myofascial tightness, as I said before, and assisting in recovery, so as simple as aiding blood flow. How does it work? Right, fascia is a band of connective tissue that wraps around pretty much every part of the body. So when you've got fascial tightness, so it's kind of like glad wrap that surrounds all these muscles. So every muscle in the body has a fascial layer around it, and that compartmentalizes the body. It makes things work more efficiently. It prevents the spread of infection. It's a really important structure. Over time, what will happen is that will chronically shorten and tighten. When you put a long sustained pressure through it, which is what you do on a foam roller, you're actually breaking up some of those adhesions, you're stimulating a bit more blood supply and you're stretching those out. So it's really important to try and lengthen the fascia as well. People talk about it a bit like being the casing around the sausage. It doesn't matter how much you stretch a muscle, if you don't release the fascia, you will still have this sensation of tightness and this dysfunction. So it's really important to try and open this fascia out, which is why we have to have long sustained stretches and long sustained kind of pressure on these muscles. So when you go and see any kind of soft tissue therapist, whether it's a physio or an osteo, and they put that really long, slow drag through certain muscle areas, what they're actually trying to do is improve the fascial length. So it's a really important structure within the body and it can cause lots of injuries long term. So that's what fascia is. It also increases blood flow. So blood is the key to anything healing and repairing in the body. So increasing blood flow tends to reduce post-exercise soreness, and it will also tend to improve the healing process. And lengthen tissues as well. So when do you do it? We suggest people don't do direct tissue kind of activities like foam rolling and spiky balling more than every 48 hours. It is a form of tissue trauma. It's quite hard on the muscle and the fascia, so doing it too consistently can be a bit like poking a bruise. People can get away with every 24 hours, but it's probably best to err on the side of conservatism, and depending on how firmly you do it, and we would advise you do it to the point of significant discomfort. Like this should not be a nice thing to do to yourself. So yes, every 48 hours is probably as much as people can tolerate. Don't do it after a particularly hard session, or if you have any kind of muscle trauma or injury. So you'd give it a 12 to 24 hour break after you've really gone hard. It's quite hard to go hard enough on a bike to actually generate a muscle tear or genuine tissue trauma. So you're normally pretty good to go, well, kind of as soon as you've gotten off the bike if you have to, but certainly with running and things like that, where you get a lot of eccentric muscle load, running down hills where you get a lot of that post-activity soreness, you wouldn't want to be foam rolling directly after doing that because you're probably causing a bit more bleeding in the area that's already getting some micro tears in it. We tend not to want to do it over tendon and bone. Neither tendon it's not completely inelastic, but it's pretty close to it. So it's effectively a solid structure. You're not going to get any benefit from rolling out a tendon, for example, and bone. Clearly, bone is not going to lengthen by rolling it. So avoid tendon and bone if for no other reason than it kind of doesn't feel very good. It certainly won't be helping, and it can damage a tendon. If it's slightly irritable, you can annoy a tendon, and you've got to be very careful with direct pressure to tendons. They don't like compression very much. And of course, doing it more frequently than that 48-hour gap that I spoke about. Righto, in terms of what you need, it's as simple as a willingness to hurt yourself and a good quality foam roller. So foam rollers need to be hard. There's no point having a soft foam roller. So if you want to pass that around, you'll see it's quite solid. They really need to be, pool noodles won't do it. You'll deform a pool noodle far sooner than what you'll deform your muscle or the fascia. So pool noodles are not going to cut it. It needs to be big enough that you can actually get a fulcrum point on it. So you can, when you put your body load through it, it's actually high enough that you can compress hard enough, because all of these exercises and activities involve basically body weight through that structure. And it needs to be about the right length that you can actually start to get it in the right spots. If they're too long, they're often too cumbersome. And if they're too narrow, they can really create an area of peak pressure and not feel particularly good either. They can be a bit too brutal. There's lots of different variations. You can get ones with knobs on them. You can do all sorts of things. Really, I'm a pretty plain kind of guy. So I tend to prefer just a bog standard foam roller, but people are very welcome to get things with knobs and nodules and those sorts of things. They're really good for broad surfaces. So foam rollers are really good for broad structures. Things in particular, the thoracic spine, which Sheila will be talking about a little bit later. Also the lats, so down through the side here, We've got a bit of a handout here that's got some basic foam rolling activities on it. Also, quadriceps are a big one. Actually, I'll be going through that on my next slide. Right, so quads are the big one. They tend to shorten and tighten. We tend to be very dominant through our quads and not strong enough through our glutes, so they get overworked on the bike. So foam rolling your quads is pretty simple. Lisa, did you want to demonstrate?
Yeah, can I have
Yep.
I don't really use that. Just here.
Lisa didn't know she was doing this before tonight.
Quads.
Yep.
Yep.
You want this one?
Thank you, Murray. Do you want to do it on the table, Lisa? It's actually...
It's a kitchen table, Lisa. It's okay.
No, she's very used to working on tables. It was how she paid for uni.
Wow.
Yeah. Anyway, that's rolling the quads. Right. The hamstrings is basically the inverse of that. Do you want to come over this side, Lisa? It might give people a better view.
Yeah.
Keep your toes on the ground.
Look
rather
what I'm
than your
doing.
toes
Can you
off.
guys not get up and have a walk around? Because I'm doing this for you.
Do you want to go like that?
Right?
Yeah, okay.
Ham.
Yep. So again, it's all body weight based. So you're putting your own body weight down through the roller. So when you are tough, like Lisa is, you can actually focus the pressure more by putting one leg on top of the other. But again, it's all about getting compression through those muscles and long, slow rolls from one end of the muscle through to the other end. It's pretty intuitive, this kind of stuff. Calves are the other one. So calves tend to constantly shorten on a bike as well. So you just go a little bit lower and you can put one leg over the top of the other and get more pressure through it, like so.
And Tom, you're suggesting to do this for until it hurts.
Yeah, until the muscle releases as well. Like you'll get a sense of it actually backing off, and it won't be as tender. But it definitely should hurt when you're doing it initially, and then over the course of 90 seconds to 2 minutes, it should begin to ease off. So glutes is the next one. I tend to put an ankle, to open up the hip joint, I tend to put an ankle on the opposite knee, and then that's it. And then perch your backside on it.
We didn't practice it.
We did not rehearse this. Other way, that's it, yep. So by opening up the hip like that, it actually really focuses pressure in through the glutes. A spiky ball is better at getting into the glutes than this is, but this is actually a really good introduction to it. It's much gentler than doing it on a spiky ball. Righto, and then thoracic spine. So one of the big things that people often underthink on a bike is the fact that their rib cage needs to be flexible and mobile. The act of sitting on a bike will shorten and tighten structures around the front of your body, so particularly pecs, lats and abs. And over time what will happen is you'll get this really anterior kind of shoulder position and head position, and it really compromises thoracic function. So that's an issue for breathing. So a lot of us, well, most of us try and go as fast as we possibly can on a bike. 12% of your metabolic activity at threshold is associated with changing the shape of your rib cage. If you're really stiff and tight through your rib cage, which you will be if you spend a lot of time on a bike and at a desk and in front of a computer, you're reducing the speed and the efficiency with which you can change the shape of your rib cage. So most people can breathe roughly 50 times a minute. The elite cyclist can breathe for the same tidal volume about 70 times a minute. It's a much more efficient action. The transfer of gases is much greater off the back of that improved range of movement, flexibility and muscle function. So given that cycling continually shortens and tightens these structures and reduces the range of movement you've got through your rib cage and your thoracic spine, it's really important to get on top of these things. It can also long-term cause lots of shoulder dysfunction. So this is what we see a lot clinically. A lot of shoulder injuries occur because of that constant rolled forward posture. A lot of neck pain, a lot of headaches, all of those sorts of things are driven by that thoracic curve forward. So you need to be extending to try and minimise the effect that cycling has on it. And also there's a performance benefit to it as well. Righto, so with lats, and again that's in the handout, but you basically lie on your side and roll backwards and forwards along that. The lats are a massive muscle. They're a muscle that help to stabilise you on the bike. So when you reach forward like this, so they're working all the time. They also are associated with changing the shape of your rib cage as you breathe. So these muscles shorten and tighten over time and can cause lots of lower back and upper back issues as well as shoulder problems. So they're a really undervalued muscle. Righto, the big one, the ITB. Yeah.
No thanks.
So ITBs, just as a quick anatomy breakdown, so before doing osteo, I did an anatomy degree, and basically the ITB is a really thick band of connective tissue. It runs down the side of the quad. It's tough enough that you can pick up a car with it. It is really, really tough. You can increase the length of the iliotibial band by about 0.25%. It is not a lot. It's effectively a tendon. It's not anatomically, but for the sake of this discussion, we'll say it is. It runs down into the side of the knee. It can cause lots of problems down through the outside of the knee, but it's predominantly caused by hip dysfunction and poor control through the glutes and the pelvis. So as a result, foam rolling the ITB itself is going to achieve very little. What it will do is it will actually get into the vastus lateralis, which is the large quadricep muscle. I don't have large quadricep muscles at all, so you can't see mine, but it comes up the outside of the quad there. It's often overused in cyclists because of that external rotation. So it's a muscle that you do need to release, but rolling out the side of your leg to work the ITB is really flawed logic. But certainly pick up the quad. So you don't have to go right on the outside, but you can come down through kind of that front quarter of it and you'll pick up the vastus lateralis through there. It'll be very painful, which is good. It should be. It's a hard working muscle, but really important to try and get that, but don't worry about the ITB because that's really not what you're achieving. The way to get on top of ITB issues is to strengthen and control the pelvis, particularly the glute medius, and also to use a spiky ball through the outside of your hip, which we'll get to in just a moment. Any questions on that? So the spiky ball, this is a really perverse tool. So obviously we spoke about pressure equals force divided by area with respect to saddles. It's the same with self-treatment. So clearly the area with a spiky ball is far less than it is with a foam roller. Hey? That's how you spell it, isn't it?
I put an E in.
I put an E.
Okay, well, there you go. Right, so what's the difference? Why would you get a foam roller and a spiky ball? As I said before, these are really good for the hard to get to spots. Like you can do shoulder stuff, you can do all sorts of things. We're not going to go there today, but if you start YouTubing things, you'll find bucket loads of ways to use a spiky ball. It is really, 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 really good for the glutes. So I'll do this since Lisa's obviously worn out.
Do that. That's how I do my glutes. I don't use the foam roller.
Yeah, so we use this for pretty much glutes. So that's it there.
Facial
Yep.
expression you should have as well.
So again, same sort of thing. Lie here for 90 seconds to 2 minutes. It's pretty uncomfortable, but that's okay. So's marriage.
Now. So you can.
That spiky ball could end up in an
Yeah, they could.
So what you'd do is you'd move around until you get to a particularly uncomfortable spot, which we would probably call it a trigger point.
Absolutely.
And then oscillate very small
Yep.
amplitude there, or just hold the body weight on it.
So the
That's
key,
a great way to do glutes.
this is the key for glutes. With glutes, you basically use the greater trochanter as a landmark. So it's the bony point on the outside of your hip. You don't want to be there. There's bursa that sit over the top. There's lots of things that you don't want to be compressing. So if you can imagine a semicircle running from here all the way around through the backside down to the outside of the leg, you want to hit everything through here. So you want to get quite lateral. You want to get up into the TFL, which is the bit that controls the length of the ITB, as well as the glute medius on the outside. You want to get deep into piriformis, which is really uncomfortable, but is very, very effective. And you want to get glute max as well, which you'll pick up just by getting to those other ones. So as Lisa said, you basically find the sorest part, you rock slightly backwards and forwards on it over the course of 60 seconds to 2 minutes, and you should feel it start to release. And then you move on to the next spot. It is really, really good to get into these spots. So trigger points, just in terms of why these are really important, so you can get into calves and feet. You will have some myofascial releasing effect with a spiky ball, but it's not the same as with a foam roller. But it's really important to get into the trigger points. So trigger points are kind of those knots that you feel in muscles. they're deeply unpleasant. They'll typically refer somewhere else. So they're a hypersensitive area within the length of a muscle. When you have a trigger point in a muscle, the muscle is dysfunctional. You cannot contract it quickly or at the right time or at the right phase of movement. So there tends to be a bit of a lag in the muscle with trigger points in them, which means that you tend to lose control of that area, that hip, or that joint, and you'll end up getting injured over time with enough kind of trigger point activity. You get trigger points by constant repetitive movement, which is exactly what cycling does. So it's really important to try and get into these trigger points and release them. It's the way we release them with dry needles, with elbows, with lots of other types of techniques. Spiky balls do a really, really good job of it. All right, I shall move on and let Sheila speak.
Alrighty. Does that clear?
Yeah.
Oh, there we go. Okay, perfect, thank you. When I said yes to this, there was no mention of YouTube Live. I'm just gonna put that out there, but I think it's too late to back out at this point. All right, so we are talking all things stretching now. So we'll flick over and have a bit of a chat about the purpose of stretching out our muscles. It is a bit of a boring activity. I give out stretches daily and I see people grimace a little bit, but I try to reinforce how important it is for our muscles when we're using them every day. So the purpose of stretching is to increase the muscle flexibility. And essentially by increasing that muscle flexibility, we're increasing the length, we're maintaining really good joint range, and then as a result, we'll be able to improve performance and also prevent injury, okay? So how do we stretch? There's lots of different types of stretching, and you've probably heard of many different types out there. We're going to keep it nice and basic tonight. So we're going to talk about static stretching. It's one of the easiest ways to stretch, and it's also one of the most safe ways to stretch. Okay, there's lots of techniques out there. I'm not going to name any necessarily, but there's probably more risky stretching. But if we look at the basic, simple, easy stretch, we're looking at static stretch. So what that means is we hold the muscle in a lengthened position for a sustained period, and that sustained period needs to be 30 seconds or more. Any less than 30 seconds and probably absolutely useless to be doing it. You won't have any carryover effect, any benefit from that. So when you're stretching, I would recommend getting out your phone timer, having the 30-second countdown, or get really good at 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, or 1 cat and dog, 2 cat and dog, any of those things. Pick whatever it is, but make sure it is 30 seconds because it's a lot longer than you think. I went to a spin class tonight and 30 seconds felt like a very long time. So it's the same for stretching. It will be longer than you might think. So when should we be doing stretching? The best time and probably the only time to stretch is after exercise, okay? So when you've gone for a run, when you've jumped on the bike, anything like that, after exercise is when we do these static stretches. Before activity, you don't want to be doing these type of stretches. At that point, the muscle's not warmed up, it doesn't really want to be lengthened out, okay? You hear about dynamic stretching, so that's things like you see people jogging on the spot, doing high knees, kicking their bottom. That's really appropriate before exercise, but static stretching is not. The muscle's not warm, it doesn't want to be lengthened just yet. So, I'm guessing a lot of you would get out in the morning and ride. What I think is a really good time is you go for the ride, jump off the bike, jump in the shower. Just after you've had the shower is a perfect time to stretch out those muscles. They're warm from being on the bike. They're even warmer from being in the shower. And so that's a really good time and a time where they are agreeable to being stretched out. All right, so that's the best time to stretch out. The other thing with stretching is you have to be patient. So with many things in training, if you do stretching once a month, probably even once a week, it's not going to be that helpful. You're not going to see any change. You're going to come back to me a week later and said, I did them once and my muscles are still the same tightness. That's because it's something that you need to do regularly, okay? So ideally, every time you jump off the bike, stretching, unlike the foam rolling, unlike the spiky ball, it's risk-free and you're not going to cause any damage by doing it every single day or every single time you exercise. The thing to look out for stretching is these stretches should feel uncomfy and it should feel a bit of a pulling sensation, but you shouldn't have any excruciating pain, okay? There shouldn't be as much grimacing as you'll have on the foam roller or the spiky ball. It should just be uncomfortable. If there is excruciating pain, that's probably the time to check in with someone. Make sure that your technique's appropriate and also make sure that you're not, you haven't got an injury that you didn't know about or on the verge of doing an injury as well. Okay, so stretching uncomfortable, but not excruciating pain. What we're going to do now is we're going to go through a few common stretches that are really important for cyclists based on the big muscles that we use, but also based on those sustained postures that Tom's kind of covered, where we end up in this quite a forward position and we try and reverse that off the bike. So the stretching isn't just about stretching out the things we've used, it's also about stretching out and reversing the effect of that static posture. All right, and I have two models here today to show. They are my bosses, so I had to say that they were the best looking models I could get from Osteohealth, but I was signed and had to say that, so don't believe it. Okay, so we're starting with glutes and hamstrings. So these two muscles we use quite a bit on the bike. What I'm thinking, so people can see, should we do one here and one over the back for the back people, or just one here? What would you two like to do? Can everyone at the back, if you stand up, are you able to see? And with the pictures, will that be okay? I reckon we'll be right. Okay, so I'm gonna get either Lisa or Tom, whoever would like to. All right. Tom here is gonna show us our glute stretch. So lying on your back, you cross one leg over the other. For some people, if you have really tight glutes, you might get to this point and go, oh my goodness, I can feel, so Tom would be feeling his left glute if they were super tight. If not, then what you do is grab onto your thigh or shin and then draw it towards your body there. And you can push the knee out if you're still not getting a stretch there. What you try and do is have a nice relaxed head and neck if you can. Yeah, so you relax that back down. If holding onto the shin is too much, then you can hold onto the thigh instead, okay, and making sure that you relax down there. So that one gets into our glute muscles and lengthens that one out, and we're using that a lot on the bike. The next one is our hamstring stretch. So our hamstring stretch, we can see here, we have one leg out straight and the other bent at the side, perfect. Then what you wanna do, you wanna maintain a really nice straight back. So what you don't wanna do is end up curling like this, because like that, you're actually just stretching out nerves more so than muscle. So if you keep your back nice and straight, I always say tilt from the hips, and then where you should feel it is in the back of the thigh, okay? So if you do the curve one, you'll start to get it all through the back of the leg, even into the back of the back. You really want to just be feeling it in the back of the thigh.
A lot of these stretches are about pelvic tilting. So when you tilt your pelvis, so if I rotate my pelvis that way, it actually, because the hamstring attaches onto the back of it, I can get a stretch immediately. It's probably a little easier to demonstrate doing, sorry Sheila.
No, you're right.
Doing this, if I do that, tilt my pelvis that way, straight away I'm feeling it deep in my hamstring. It's the opposite action when you're trying to do it for hip flexors, but certainly in here, when you tilt your pelvis that way, straight away you're going to get a stretch down through there. You should not be doing things like this and things like that. That is a much stronger stretch for me than doing this.
Yeah, cool. Talking of hip flexors, our next one is our hip flexor stretch. So now we're going to tilt the pelvis the other way. So in this example here, Tom is stretching out his right hip, and the idea being that he tucks his bottom under and then he pushes forward, and he should be feeling at the front of the right hip through those hip flexors. You can also pop your foot on a stool, so you get a little bit more flexion. So bend at that knee, which then stretches them out even further, like so. And you can make it even harder by bringing your arm up to the side and then reaching across and getting a bit of a side stretch at the same time, okay? Excellent. So that's hip flexors. We now move on to our upper body. So Tom mentioned before how we can end up in quite a forward position on the bike. One of the things that can contribute if we're hunched over all day is if our pec muscles across here, so our chest muscle, if they tighten up, we end up pulling the shoulders even further forward. So we want to reverse that and go the other direction and stretch out the front of the chest. So like Tom's demonstrating here, hooking your arm on a wall, even on a little bit of a ledge in the door, and then rotating the other direction, and you will feel it immediately through that area there. Our last two stretches for today are all about the spine. So obviously on the bike, we're very forward. We end up, Lisa's going to be our demonstrator for thoracic spine. So we're very forward on the bike, and we end up then flexing or bending our thoracic spine forward, and we want to reverse that and go the other direction. So what we do is we can lie over a foam roller like so, and we're opening up the back. As well as on the bike, lots of us sit at computers during the day, we're sitting in cars, we're always very forward. I reckon everyone in the world could probably benefit from going the other direction because we spend so much of our life forward. Same thing for our lumbar spine. So once again, we're in a bent forward position. When we're sitting at the desk, we're bent forward. All these things, and we're never going the other direction. Okay, so at the basic level, you prop up on your elbows. Your low back should be nice and relaxed. So it's not tense, it's not holding you there. What's holding you there is your shoulders. Okay, so they're doing the work, the back stays nice and relaxed. What I like to do in this position is get the client to breathe in, take a big breath in, breathe out, and let their low back relax. It's all about relaxing that low back. If that's quite comfortable, then what you can do is prop up on your hands and push yourself up even further, getting even more bend in that low back. Okay, so they're probably a few of the common ones for the cyclists out there, but there's plenty more that I could give as well. I think that's all of them. That is. Back to Tom. Thanks, guys. Well done.
Yep, self-portrait.
There you go. Thanks.
Thanks for not saying it's me.
Thank you, Sheila. Righto. Strength. Injury prevention, again, is another reason why we do it. So certain muscle groups switch off when you're riding a bike, certain get overused. You need to have a really robust, resilient body. Cyclists typically don't have them, and if anyone's seen an elite cyclist, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. It is a very dysfunctional body. It's built only to ride a bike quickly. There's no lateral movement, there's no rotation on a bike. All of those sorts of things can create real weaknesses. And if you've ever seen a cyclist try and do any concreting or wheelbarrowing, you'll quickly notice they're not particularly good at it. So in terms of performance, strength is really important as well, but not necessarily how you think. So we talk about power all the time on a bike, and lots of people have power meters, which is great. But cycling's far more about fatigue resistance than it is about power production. So it's quite easy to create 400 and 500 watts, and pretty much anyone here, if they got on the bike and pedaled around the corner and accelerated hard, they'd get 400 or 500 watts. The challenge is being able to do it for an hour. So we all have the muscle strength to be elite cyclists. We just can't resist fatigue long enough for that to be the case. So fatigue resistance comes down to lots of micro efficiencies across the body and the bike. We all have a finite capacity to generate power, and we lose power through we lose efficiencies through lots of different things, whether it's through a slightly unstable pelvis on the bike, whether it's through poor bike positioning, whether it's through tight muscle groups, whether it's through weak muscle groups or dysfunctional muscle groups. But strength-based work is really important to try and maintain a normal body shape and a normal functional body type off the bike, but also trying to improve performance and being able to maintain these postures and not come up with an injury, 6 months down the track, 12 months down the track, 2 years down the track. We do not need to do massive loads on a bike. There is no point in cycling where you are effectively doing a deadlift or a squat with 150 kilos of load on it. It doesn't replicate what we do on a bike at all. So it's kind of fundamentally pointless to be doing that for most of us. So a lot of the body weight and control based exercises are far more kind of fitting for cycling, and even some plyometric stuff for higher level people who are looking at maintaining some explosive power. But you don't need to be squatting massive loads. And I'm talking about endurance cycling here. Clearly, the chap with the rather large quads at the start, he was a track sprinter. So track sprinting, where you're doing 10 or 15 second max efforts, is a completely different ball game. So what I'm talking about is standard recreational cycling, time trialing, racing, those sorts of things. And again, for elite level cyclists, then certainly higher resistance training is valid, but for most of us it's not. We really want to be able to control our body parts, and we want a well-functioning, good body off the bike as well. So strength training improves efficiency by improving control and sequencing of muscle contraction. So that goes back to what I was saying before about that pedaling action on the bike and getting glutes to engage when they should and all of those sorts of things. It's really important to reinforce good technique with this. And the classic we see with a lot of people are lunges and squats, which are a perfectly fine exercise and things that cyclists should be doing. Most people do them really badly, and they end up reinforcing particularly quad dominant behaviours when a squat and a lunge should be about the glutes. Most people will inevitably load the quads more, and so they tend to reinforce this already poor pattern of behaviour rather than rehab it. So form is absolutely key with this kind of thing. Technique is everything. If you can't control the movement, if you're starting to really waver and wobble, if you're planking and side planking, it's time to stop. If your body is not in a good posture when you're doing it, it's time to stop. You will improve far faster than you think you will. So it's quite rapid, the improvement you'll get with some of these activities and exercises. But again, if you're trying to do it with poor patterns of movement and behaviour, just reinforcing bad technique, and you will end up defeating the purpose of the exercise, but also becoming injured. And the other one too is to condition key muscle groups to maintain posture on the bike. It's not an easy position to hold this one for 3 hours or 4 hours, or if you're a Ironman 5 or 6 hours, down like that. You need to have good muscle strength to be able to deal with that. So building strength and endurance in these key muscle groups is really important for comfort and, again, injury management and performance ultimately too, because nothing's slower than sitting on a time trial bike up like this trying to give your back and neck a break. And reducing aberrant movement. So by that I mean that the wiggling and wobbling on a bike. So there's a few things around aerodynamics that are really important. One of them is stability. The more someone's trunk moves, the slower they're going for the same effort. It's really important to be stable through your body. If you don't have good body awareness and proprioception it's called, if you don't have good body awareness and you're rocking and rolling on the bike, you're losing performance, you're increasing risk of injury and saddle sore and back pain and all of those sorts of things. So this is the diagram that I was speaking about before. These are the prime movers of cycling. You can see the glute does that. So it's a massive contributor to movement. A little bit of quad, a little bit of hamstrings. Sorry, a little bit of hamstrings here, a little bit of calves down at the bottom. But predominantly glute and quad. And the sequencing is really important. You can see that the glute comes on first in the pedal stroke and then the quad comes in afterwards. You really need to have good glutes on a bike, and if they're really tight, they're not going to be firing well. You'll be losing power and performance as a result of it, and also increasing injury risk, increasing the chance of back pain, increasing the chance of ITB issues, knee pain, saddle soreness, back pain, lots of things on a bike. The biggest thing we see is quad dominance and glute weakness. So by that we mean that people are using mostly quad and not enough glute. So again, these are the common signs and symptoms. What we like to get people doing, and we do this a lot, and it's remarkable how bad people are at doing this. I'm actually going to do this on the kitchen table so people can see it, and I'll do it this time. And this is what we mean by about doing it properly. So as with any training plan, things need to be specific, and they also need to be overloaded over time, and you need good basics to do it properly. I'll just lie that way. That's all right. You weren't expecting this, were you? So what we're trying to do, people can't just voluntarily turn glutes on when they're riding when they're riding the bike. So you've got to get them working well off the bike before you get them working well on the bike. And the first movement we get people to do is actually just to contract them without contracting hamstrings. So most people will contract hamstrings when they try and lift up because they sit on their glutes all the time. Muscles do not like being sat on for extended periods of time, so they become dysfunctional because of it. So to get some feedback, we'll typically get the hand on the actual butt and then we'll contract the muscle without the hamstring working. Once people can do that in isolation, we'll start to get them to contract it and then come up into extension and then back down. And we'll repeat this 15 or 20 times, multiple sets on both sides. And over time, you'll start to get this reinforced good movement pattern. So you'll start sequencing the glutes before you'll start hitting the hamstrings as well. So from there, you then go into a bridging pattern, which people will have seen before probably. Probably won't do this one on the... No.
Do you want to do it?
So down like this, and again, we really like to pre-fire the glutes. So you stick your hands on your backside. This is when you get in touch with yourself. Because again, as soon as you touch a muscle, you're more likely to fire it well. So we contract the glutes, and then we gently rise up, hold it for a count of 2, and come down for a count of 3. And then we do multiple repetitions of this until your form starts to fail. We will often see people when they do this, one side will dominate, so they'll start to hitch on the way up, or it'll shift, or it just won't fire at all and you'll just see nothing but hamstrings, or people will start to cramp in the hamstrings. So that is the first step, and that's normally the first 3 to 4 weeks, is getting people to do those types of exercises. They're really mundane, they're really non-sexy, but they're effective over the long run. And we really need to be recruiting these muscles in the right pattern of movement and the right sequence for it to be effective long term.
Just with that bridging, how are you rotating the pelvis during that?
I'm not. All I'm doing is bringing it straight up. So, and I'm really trying to squeeze my backside as if I'm making diamonds. That's a really weird analogy, isn't it? Anyway, that's my subconscious for you. From there, we move into kind of bigger ticket items like squats and lunges. And form is so important for this kind of stuff. So we will typically get people to do a squat where they've got something in front of them. I won't be able to do it on that, but a straight back chair is often really good. I'll probably be able to do it here. If I fall over, then tell my wife I loved her. So the biggest problem we see with pretty much everyone who does any type of squatting and lunging is that they move forward like that so that their knee goes over their toes. That ends up generating an awful lot of peak knee load, so behind the patella, but it also again means that the quadriceps are working really hard. We actually want people to sit down. It's very much a sitting down action, as if you're going down onto a toilet seat. But to reinforce that, so if I do this with bad technique, if that had you can see that I'm pushing that seat forward. If it had a solid back, it would be better. Whereas with reasonably good technique, and this is kind of funny me doing this, you sit back and down and away, and you're not knocking the chair over. So that's the way we try and use this as a reinforcing technique. The other one that we look at doing a lot are lunges. So classically, people will lunge forward. The issue that we have with that is that when you lunge forward, your body weight is already transferring forward, so you're more likely to load the quad and the knee again. So in preference to that, and it's exactly the same movement, we would prefer people to take a step back and then drop and sink through and come back up. Does that make sense? So your momentum's shifting you backwards instead of shifting you forwards. It's really important to maintain good posture and control with these. Load and reps and all of those sorts of things, putting weights in hands, all of that stuff is fine when you can do it properly. So it's doing the basics well. My intention is to keep stable in this plane as well as stable in that plane on the way down. So core is a really overused word. You want a stable pelvis, but firing abdominal muscles and isolating muscle groups in that way, probably not. We're just trying to track good form. So poor pelvic control So this is the other thing we see. So rocking and rolling on the bike, and everyone will have seen people who do a lot of this. It increases the risk of saddle soreness and genital dysfunction purely from the standpoint that you're soaring backwards and forwards over the seat. There's obviously a performance impediment as well, but there's a real increased risk of low back pain. So because of the way that people wiggle and shift, there's just all these shear forces going through the lower back and the joints which don't like it. So loss of efficiency and increased drag. So again, things, oops, a daisy. So things like lunges again, bridging again, Supermans, do people know what that means? Lying on your stomach and one arm up, so you're controlling your movement that way, and one leg. The classic plank, which is a really good thing for replicating the posture on a bike and firing the right muscle groups at the right time. And again, if you start to wobble and rock and roll and sink through your spine as you're doing it, then you need to stop, walk away, come back and repeat. So you should be able to get up to 2 and 3 minutes of planking without too many issues, and then you do 2 or 3 reps of it. But if you can't get anywhere near that, you start off doing 10, 15, 20 seconds, walk away, come back and do multiple repetitions of it. The side plank, which is really quite hard to do, and most people stink at it. So, and what people will typically have one side that's significantly worse than the other. So the side plank is as simple as that, and maintaining a nice clean line through here. It is quite hard to do. And again, you should be able to get up to 2 minutes with that. And you can add layers of complexity to it with weights and with rotation and all sorts of things. All of these ones that we're talking about today, we're really not going into classic overload principles. We're just looking at the basic activity. And if you can get up to 2 minutes side planking, you're probably doing pretty well. And then a basic push-up is also a really good activity or strengthening exercise for people. Always these clauses. So if pain is intense or it's not getting better after 48 hours, come and see one of us. Questions? For any of us, all of us? Lisa, how do you put up with him, that kind of thing?
Any kind of age-related criteria that you might apply? Should you, if you're a bit older, should you start these things a bit more gently, or
when do you start tapering?
Tapering. The load-bearing nature of these exercises and muscle bulk and density is key to ageing well. And I think that there was a really good program on Catalyst a few months ago now about how increasing muscle bulk and density is very analogous to the osteoporotic kind of bone bank concept. So the more muscle bulk that you have, the older you get, the less likely you are to have diabetes and weight issues, and reduces arthritic change and reduces the damage due to falls and all of those sorts of things. So cycling is fantastic cardiovascularly. It's really quite bad musculoskeletally. That's its one downfall. There's not enough impact with it, which the body needs impact. It needs these lifting, challenging forces. So you need to create them off the bike doing other stuff. In terms of what you can and can't do with age, you're as fit and functional as I am, I would suspect. So I think you could probably, just start the same as everyone does, start off at a low level and progressively build over time. It always takes longer to recover with age, probably increased or decreased tissue elasticity, so greater risk of injury possibly, but just a matter of you're also much wiser normally, so you can self-manage better or self-modify. Is that? Anything else?
The hammy and glute stretches you showed both were in externally rotated positions. Someone like me who's had hip replacement externally rotated puts me into a potential hip dislocation position. So there are other
Yes.
non-externally rotated.
There are. So the hamstring stretch that I give quite often to people so that you don't have to get down on the floor and you don't have to put your leg up. I'm not going to demonstrate it, but what I would do is Is this stable? Should I demonstrate it?
I reckon you should.
Okay, all right, fine. All right, so I feel bad putting, I drink coffee here all the time. So what I'll do is put a leg up like so, probably not necessarily as high, then you can support with this leg. So you're stretching out this hamstring and leaning forward from this position. So I love giving this one to the older people that I see. Leaning forward there, and then you don't have to, hips are happy and they don't have to externally rotate as on the floor. Glutes.
I start prone doing.
Oh,
Yeah,
in and
like
out.
we've talked about some pretty advanced stretches tonight. So
Yeah.
if you can't get to those positions, come see Sheila. She'll teach you one pearl of wisdom that'll keep you safe and fit. So
Yeah.
so
So
I start it like that, Sheila.
yeah, cool. So what Lisa's doing here is lying on her tummy and then leg bent up like so. Okay, so imagine I'm lying down and then you're turning your leg in and out. So what you're doing there is you're rotating at the hip, and as a result, some people that have no hip rotation will barely get movement side to side. So that's where we'd start at a very basic level for glutes, trying to
Trying that one too would be the other. Just getting to there might even
Yeah.
be a big enough.
That's the dislocation position.
can't, yeah, as soon as you can't
It's not,
do
it's not
that.
that I can't.
You just don't want to dislocate.
I don't want to dislocate my hips. I don't want to go there.
Absolutely. That's when I would start. So lying on your tummy, leg bent up, turning, holding it in and holding it out. So you're rotating it one direction, you're rotating the other direction. You won't get as big a stretch as you would if you're obviously in that position there, but you still should get some stretch. And I think probably a lot of people that would do it, lots of us have hip restriction, and you'll do that exercise, the more you do it, the more movement side to side you'll actually get in that hip. Okay, does that help? Excellent. Any other questions?
Is it useful to warm up before rolling, or should you just go straight into it?
Just get into it.
Is it
Don't put it
a
up.
problem if you do warm up, if you have a hot bath or something like that prior?
So that's different to stretching.
Yeah, anytime stimulating blood flow is kind of what you're after with foam rolling and spiky balling. So anytime you're stimulating blood flow, whether it's through heat or whether it's through activity or exercise, is probably going to improve your response to it, to foam rolling and spiky balling and so on. Yeah. With stretching, you definitely want to be warm. So the warmer you are to stretch, the more effective the stretch will be.
So you can foam roll first thing in the morning, but you shouldn't be stretching.
Yeah. Any time you can stretch there's value in stretching at any time. The reason we talk about not stretching before activity is because it's actually it's almost like a sedative for the muscles. They don't fire particularly well. So there's been is it a myth? Probably not. There was just a lack of information around the effectiveness of stretching. So when you watch footballers stretching out hamstrings statically like this, it's really bad for them. Their risk of injury increases because of it. So what they should be doing is an active warm-up. So we know that now, which is why we're not advocating stretching before activity. So stretching post-activity is great. If the only time you can stretch during the day is first thing in the morning, go nuts. It's far better than not doing it at all. But it won't be as effective as if you'd just gone for a bike ride and you came back. Yeah.
So if you had a cold shower after you ride, would you still roll?
Yep. Your core temperature is still going to be up and going.
That's the coffee's the problem, Tom, not the coffee.
All right. Yeah, that whole sitting around in lycra thing, I don't understand that. That's,
Stand to have your coffee. That's my tip.
anything else?
Do you have any tips for, like, when you're talking about stretches and all that, tips for beginners when they haven't been on a bike for a while? What can they do when they sort of like get on the bike and they've gone for the ride and stuff and they've gotten off and they feel like really sore?
Yep. Again, depending on where the soreness is, but classically it's those muscle groups that we've explained today. So the hip flexor stretches are really key. Basic quad stretches, like this kind of thing, hamstring and glute stretches, and reversing that curve that happens on a bike. All these structures here get tight and sore, so reversing that curve is quite challenging for people, but it's actually quite effective in the long run. So yeah, it's just, you may not have the range that others might have, but definitely the same principles apply. Just be a bit gentle on yourself for a start. So foot pathology, what type of shoes? We're getting a podiatrist to come in and speak as well. So footbeds, types of cycling shoes, why people get hot spots, numbness, all of those sorts of things.
That must be the first Thursday in May, is it?
First Thursday in May.
Yep.
Yep.
So if you'd like to get some information about when these events are, our, what I would say would be a quite informative newsletter. If you would like some information about our appointments and that sort of stuff, we also run small group classes which go through all the stuff we've talked about today, progress you, and I would suggest in a safe environment, and certainly you came to mind with that, where you get back on the bike and you've got to be a bit careful and do the right thing. So sometimes consulting someone in the game can help you keep you on the straight and narrow. Like you said, form is everything. Come and give us your email address if you're happy to hear from us, and we will get in touch in the next 3 or 4 days. I won't put my team under too much of the pump. Alternatively, take our flyers here and get in touch with us, and we'll try and help you out and see you around.
There's also some basic stretches and exercises if you want to take them away here, and spiky balls and foam rollers if you need them. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Dave.
I'll get a spiky ball and put it with all the other toys.
Give it to the dog.